Okay, if we look at abortion and the beginning of life, what you really need to know very well for the question on abortion is the abortion law. And that's the 1967 Abortion Act, which was amended in 1990. Now, the 1967 Abortion Act does not actually extend to Northern Ireland. The abortion law in Northern Ireland isn't very clear, but generally an abortion will be allowed in Northern Ireland in a case where the mother's life is in danger, or if there's a severe fetal abnormality, and that's a case where the child would be so badly malformed that it would be born without a heart or a brain, or if it would be very, very seriously disabled, that its life would only last a few minutes after it was born. Generally, in those circumstances, an abortion would be allowed. Or in cases of rape or incest in Northern Ireland, the law would be it would allow that, it seems. But the law is a little bit unclear, and that's one of the things that's being debated at the moment in Northern Ireland, and probably won't be resolved until after the 2015 election. In 1967, the abortion was made legal in Britain, the 1967 Abortion Act, and that was changed in 1990 slightly to change the rules, which we'll explain in a moment. The 1967 Act doesn't actually give a woman a right to an abortion, but it protects a doctor from prosecution if he performs one. So that's the first thing. The 1967 Act doesn't actually give a woman a right to an abortion, but what it does, it protects doctors who perform one, because at the end of the day, it's the doctor who's doing the killing in the case of an abortion. It's not actually the woman but the doctor, and therefore it was doctors who needed protected under the law. And the idea was that women who were in desperate circumstances would quite often turn to what they called backstreet abortionists. That would be a doctor or a nurse who would break the law for a sum of money and give a woman an abortion. But sometimes because the facilities weren't clean or they weren't properly supervised, then women were dying because the treatment was not carried out correctly. But 1967, the law changed so long as two doctors would give their opinion that an abortion should be carried out. And the grounds for a legal abortion are, first of all, if there is a risk to the life of the mother. Secondly, if it's to prevent grave permanent injury to the physical or mental health of the mother. Then in both of those circumstances, whether mother's life is in danger or there's a danger of grave permanent injury to her physical health or her mental health, then an abortion can be carried out right until birth. So if two doctors in good faith say that if as a result of this pregnancy a woman will have a severe physical threat or severe threat to her physical health, or if there be a severe threat to her mental health and the damage will be permanent, then there can be an abortion right up until birth. This has led to situations in England, for example, where children with Down syndrome have been aborted quite late on in the pregnancy because the mother has decided she could not cope with another child or a child like that in her family. It's led to some situations which are questionable. The reason that rule is there about the grave permanent injury to mental health is really to protect women when they have been raped and want an abortion. That's why that rule is there. But it does mean that an abortion can be carried out right up until birth. Now, there are two other circumstances where an abortion is allowed, where there is just a risk of injury to the physical, mental or health of the mother greater than if the pregnancy were terminated. So that's just, there's a risk. It doesn't have to be a substantial risk, it's just a risk. And it doesn't have to be grave and permanent injury. It can just be an injury to your physical or mental health. Or if there's a risk of injury to the physical or mental health of existing children, so if her family would be adversely affected, or if there's substantial risk of the child being born seriously handicapped, then in those circumstances, a child can be aborted. Now, in C and D, in the third and fourth, where there's just a risk to the injury of the physical or mental health of existing children, or if there's just a risk to the mother, then that's only allowed up until 24 weeks. That's only allowed up to 24 weeks, because after that stage in 1990, at 24 weeks, a child could survive outside the womb. It's probably even earlier now. A child could survive outside the womb. So if a child was born prematurely, at 24 weeks, doctors could keep it alive. And it seemed to be very odd to have doctors rushing around hospitals keeping children alive who've been born prematurely in one area of the hospital, and in a room down the corridor there was a doctor killing a child of the same age because it was in the womb. And it does seem to be an odd thing that the location of the child decides whether or not the child has a right to life. So in 1990 they changed the law and said for the two grounds of risk of physical or mental injury to the mother or to her children, then the child can be aborted up to 24 weeks. The final one, substantial risk of the child being born seriously handicapped. That can also be done right up until birth. And so in those situations you can simply say, well, we're not just talking about a child that has something like that's anencephalic, in other words, a child that doesn't have a brain. That sometimes has also been used to justify the abortion of a child who has Down syndrome. The definition of seriously handicapped isn't clear. So therefore, a doctor who wanted to give a woman an abortion because their child had Down syndrome or their child was going to be born paralysed could allow that child to be aborted at 36, 37, 38 weeks, when that child, if it had been born slightly prematurely, would get to live and would be protected under the law. So the law at the moment does allow children to be killed if they're disabled under one or two grounds. It can be under the grounds of this will cause a severe, grave, permanent injury to the mother's mental health, or it can be that this child is seriously handicapped. So the mother's life does not have to be in danger. It doesn't have to be in terms of rape. It can simply be, well, the doctor says, well, the child is going to be handicapped, will have a serious effect on the mother's mental health, therefore we will abort the child. So that's where the law in Britain stands at the moment. It's important to understand there's a difference between Britain and America. In America, the woman has an absolute right to a termination of her pregnancy. So in other words, she can have an abortion simply because it's her body and she doesn't need a doctor's permission. You know, it's up to her. In Britain, it's very much about the doctor. So what are the arguments for and against abortion? Well, Christian arguments would be that, well, every human being is made in God's image. So to destroy God's image is a terrible thing. And according to Genesis chapter 9, it's murder. So to deliberately to destroy something in God's image, to destroy a person in God's image when that person is innocent of any crime and is not harming anyone, that is the definition of murder. So a clear Christian or biblical Christian point of view in this is usually to deliberately kill an innocent person is murder, when that child is harming no one, when it's not threatening anyone, when it has done no harm and through no fault of its own you decide to kill it. It's in God's image, therefore abortion's wrong. And there seem to be verses in the Bible where people talk about their existence when they were in the womb. So for example, David said, to God, you create me in my inmost being, you knit me together in my mother's womb. Jeremiah says to God, before I was born, you formed me in the womb. You knew me before I was born. You set me apart. So I knew you. You knew me when I was in the womb. In other words, David, when he says you knit me together in my mother's womb, was saying, I began in there. That was me. Whenever I was in the womb, I was a person and you made me. Jeremiah is saying, you knew me when I was in the womb. So the Bible seems to assume that the unborn child is a person, And it also says that deliberately destroying God's image is murder and is wrong. When the person bearing God's image has done no one any harm, it's not threatening anyone, then to kill the person in God's image is murder. So that would seem to be the Bible's position. The Bible would seem to rule something like abortion out completely. Are there any other arguments though? Well, if we need to talk about what we're destroying in an abortion, after 18 days, the heart of the child begins to beat. That's about 21 to 24 days you can measure it. So the heart's beginning to form at 18 days, and about 3 days later it starts to beat. 18 days it forms, 21 to 24 days it begins to beat. There are fetal brain waves produced around about 6 weeks. So about 42 days, and around that stage, you're getting brain waves. Electrical activity can be measured in and around that stage. The brain itself is beginning to form about day 23. So the brain's beginning to form around about the time the heart starts beating. Although there's certainly a spinal column there by that stage, the nervous system's beginning to grow long before brain waves start. So when does your mind begin? If you look at a picture of your brain and your spine, they seem to run into each other. So when does the mind begin? When does the soul begin? That's very difficult to know, but certainly with a beating heart from about 18 days. It's also the case that most abortions seem to happen in and around the stage of about 6, 7, 8 weeks. So before 8 weeks, that's when the vast majority of abortions are occurring. So a lot of abortions are happening when there is a beating heart, certainly, and certainly when you're starting to get things like brain waves. So a lot of abortions are stopping a child's heart, and a lot of abortions are stopping a child with brain waves. So are you killing a person? Are you not killing a person? That's a big question, because you can divide the argument of abortion into 3 parts. There's the woman's rights versus the rights of the unborn child. There's freedom of choice versus a right to life. And then there's quality of life versus sanctity of life. So woman's rights versus the rights of the unborn child. Freedom of choice versus right to life. And then quality of life versus sanctity of life. If we look at those one at a time, if you look at the woman's rights, one of the strongest arguments for abortion is that it levels the playing field for women when it comes to employment. It gives women control over reproduction. Because when 2 people have sex, there's a chance of a pregnancy, and everybody knows that. But the man gets to walk away, the woman has to carry the pregnancy with her. And that then creates a situation where employers might be reluctant to take a woman on board because, well, you could get pregnant and therefore you're going to have maternity leave and all the things that come with that. Therefore, I'm not likely to employ you. And so one of the arguments for abortion is that it gives women more control over their own bodies and some control over, or a lot of control over reproduction. They can decide if they're going to have a child or not. And so that therefore it makes life fairer for women. And quite often the argument would be then is if you're against abortion, that if you somehow think abortion is wrong, what you are trying to do is stop women getting jobs. So somehow you're anti-woman or you're anti-feminist if you are somehow against abortion. So that would be one of the arguments for abortion. It's protecting women. It's giving women an equal place in society. Against that you have the rights of the unborn child. Now, in debates